Welcome back. This is my entire engine harness that I made that is going to be going inside my rotary swapped S2000, and I'm going to be putting it in today. So I finished up this engine harness like 3 days ago, and I'm just excited how it looks. And this is going to be like the core harness for this car. I made some sub harnesses to go around everything, but before I install this, let me show you everything that entails inside this harness. It's not that much of a mess, but I'm trying to catch it though. Going over my engine harness that I made, at least the core harness. As you can see, there's not that much going on, mainly because everything that is needed is in here. So like I said, this is the core harness, and everything that will go directly to the engine gets plugged up with these Deutsch connections. So for an example, let me pull one out. Pull this one out. This is I believe this is my oil pressure, oil temp, and oil level. So instead of having these three connections already like hardwired into the harness, what I did was make several breaks to clean this up and make it easier for me to take this in and out. So I'll just find which connector goes to this. This one has a white and gray wire, so I just gotta find one that has a white and gray wire, and I believe this one's it. So all I have to do is just connect this one, make sure everything is in the right order, the oil pressure, oil temp, and oil level, and then boom. This one connector has 3 sensors that goes to the rest of the harness. That's how the rest of this harness is, where it had just multiple breaks just to make this easier for me to take this in and out and help identify which connector goes to which. Past this grommet goes to the engine, and then behind it goes to the cabin. I still have my 2 AMP connectors that goes to the VCU. I did take quite a few out. You probably can't see it in the camera, but I did take quite a few out from here. When I was doing this the first time, this is like my 3rd time remaking this, I couldn't really figure out if I wanted to use everything that came with the VCU or just try to keep it as simple as I could, and I just went with just used everything that I can with this engine, which I did. I think the first time I took this off, I had about 20 plus wires that I didn't use. Now it dropped from 20 to maybe like 4 to 6. So it's a pretty big improvement in terms of utilizing this entire VCU and this harness that I have available. But like I said, I got the 2 AMPs that still goes to the VCU. I also have my I also have my 4 25 amp connections going to the VCU. 3 of them are going outside to the engine, which is my ignition, injectors, and the starter. And then the last one is going to my fuel pump. And then I have my CAN connections. Another one is I have a 2-pin connector. This one goes to the CAN gauge, illumination, and my ignition switch. This one for my body harness that goes inside, or the patch harness. This was pretty hard for me to try to figure out how to make the body harness work with the VCU, but did some digging. I ended up grabbing a pinout for both of the connectors that went to the OEM ECU inside the car, and looked at what I needed from there, and then I ended up making the harness for this and then the sub harness to go along with it. I still need to take a look at the connectors just to make sure that this is correct, and then everything else, which I'm going to explain more on when I get inside the car and when I start hooking this stuff up. It's going to go to certain places, and I'll show you that in a moment. Back outside now. I don't have my gimbal, so I can't like angle this down while I work on it, but just take my word for it. First up, to getting this in is I'm going to fish the grommet part inside the firewall. Side note about this grommet: if you are doing an engine swap, if you have an S2000, you're doing an engine swap, keep your engine harness. This grommet, this one grommet, took me forever to get. I ended up buying 2 of them for like 80 bucks because Honda doesn't sell this grommet alone, and you can only get them with the harness. If you're doing an engine swap, you have an S2000, if you want to sell your engine, but make sure you get the harness, or at least get this grommet. This took forever to get, and in hindsight, I think it's pretty funny because I never would have known about it, but For anybody else, avoid what I did and just keep your harness to keep your grommet. Grommet is through the firewall. And surprisingly, this grommet is one of the easiest grommets I had to install, uninstall inside this entire engine bay. But anyway, it's in and everything is pretty much set up to where connectors are going to be. Unfortunately, I don't have my VCU right now. I had some problems with it where one of the retainer clips for it broke off and I could have put one of the AMP connectors in. So I shipped it off and hopefully it should be here like in the next month or so. I'm hoping for it. Now these connectors do look like just a mess, but once the VCU comes in and once everything starts getting plugged up, this should be a lot more cleaner. But I'm gonna leave it right here. I did do a pretty good measurement on where the VCU is going to be. Luckily, I still had the plate for it, so I just mounted the plate up and I remembered where the VCU sat. So all I had to do was just match it up with those connectors and then I left it there. And then I still have like my fuel pump. It's going to go out to the back. My patch harness is going to be connected to this connector and this one. I'm going to figure out which wires I need to get cut, and then I'm going to start snipping them eventually and then start wiring it into the patch harness. Have a CAN connection, which this connection going for the ECU is going to fill up for this CAN, and this is going to power up the CAN hub with my gauge, my instrument cluster, my IC7, and all the other things that I can't remember right now that is going to get power from here. And then you'll have my 2-pin connection right here that goes to my CAN gauge and my ignition. Everything is set up right now, so now I'm going to go into the engine bay and start plugging everything up from there. Got my box of all of my patch harnesses. Kind of switch between the term being a patch harness and like a sub harness. But if you hear me say patch and sub harness, I'm talking about the same thing. It's the exact same thing in my book. So I'm gonna start working on it. Actually, before I do that, I need to show off my ignition coil mount that I made. I'm going to talk about this once this goes back into the car, but I will say that I ended up having to make a new bracket to get this ignition coils to fit. I'll explain that a little bit more once all this stuff is in, because this might have a little bit of story to it. So the harness is in and I got everything pretty much panned out on where the connectors are going to go. Now I'm going to start getting my patch harnesses and start plugging everything up. We'll see how everything looks. I did some pretty good measurements, so I'm pretty confident that everything's going to line up exactly how I want with some room to spare. Everything connected and ready to go for this harness. I do have to keep this thing down, but the harness is set up, routed. Pretty good job. I mean, there's kind of like a rat's nest behind the oil filler. It's all good to go. Might have to rearrange some of these wires around to kind of make it a little bit cleaner. I'm not gonna mess with it too much. I wanted to go over this sub harness idea. As you know, if you have taken out engine harnesses before or taken out clips for like injectors or whatever, sometimes these plastic clips will break when you're taking them out. Unfortunately for me, they won't, because these are brand new. But let's say that, this clip broke and, and I can't clip this on to the coolant anymore. Typically, if this happens, you have to take off this pin or cut the wires and then make a new connection for it. I don't think it'll probably stretch the wires, but what will happen is that, you're losing more wire out of the entire harness. But for this, if this breaks, all I gotta do is just depin this connection and then just make a new harness section for, in this case, the coolant temp. And I can do the same thing for the alternator, the trigger, the ignition coil. Speaking about the ignition coil, talking about the bracket. So I originally got I think it's called an MP Fab ignition coil brackets. I got 2 of them before. I made a video about it. And for the most part, they work. They are fantastic brackets, but unfortunately, it wasn't fitting my application. If you're running a Elite rotary intake manifold paired with some other stuff, it might not work for you. I know for me, I was having problems with the manifold and the pedestal. Ignition coil on the front rotor was coming into contact with this motor part of the throttle body. And then bottom ignition coil coming in contact with this oil filler. Couldn't use it. I actually ended up trying to modify that one bracket for this side so much, I ended up just breaking it. And those things weren't cheap. They're like, I think 120, 150 bucks a pop. So I ended up looking online for a new bracket that most likely will sit like on the side rail right here, right next to like the steering rack. That unfortunately didn't work either because I couldn't like route my harness around the way I wanted to, and it was kind of like really bulking out, and I think it was going to hit my steering rack. So I ended up making this ignition coil bracket. This fits pretty well underneath the intake manifold. Don't mind these cuts. I was trying to get this really low profile. I will be going over again and probably getting some new spacers for this. Ended up making this. This was my third attempt finding a bracket solution. And with this setup, I have one connector that powers my ignition coils and my injectors when I get them all in one. Yeah, I made a new sub harness for it. The one I originally got was a bit more bulkier than this, and the harness was so long it actually would have went into my firewall. I didn't need that much wire for that, so I ended up chopping it down, looking at how it was wired it up myself to how you see it right now. I really like how it looks. It's pretty low profile, especially to get one of my sub harnesses for the front, and then I'll still have room so I can put my injectors with the wiring for it as well. When I do get my injectors, I have the wires for it. All done. I just depinned and repinned this connector for the cowl, so one end goes to the other. I'm gonna tidy this up a little bit, like in a week or so, just so I can get everything kind of set up a little bit better. That's it. Took a few weeks to do, but finally did it. That's the engine harness for this car. Actually, my first engine harness that I made from scratch.